Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Deep within a futuristic metropolis called Neo-Lumen, where glass and steel skyscrapers contrast with dark, forgotten alleys, secrets lurk that defy human understanding. Among the shadows of this technological city, ancient cults survive, performing rituals that defy the laws of nature. In one of these alleys, under the rare light of the red moon, a ritual takes place that could change the destiny of humanity. And it is in this scenario that our story unfolds, where a young photographer, tormented by visions, finds himself at the center of a nightmare that transcends time and reality. I'm Davi, a 27-year-old photographer known for capturing otherworldly moments with a precision that many consider impossible. My life has always been marked by inexplicable visions that over time became more intense and frequent. These visions led me to Neo-Lumen, where mysterious disappearances occur every red moon cycle. My talent and my curse made me known in the city, and that's how I received a peculiar contract to document the events preceding the next disappearance. The city, with its imposing architecture and advanced technology, seemed like a living entity, pulsing with vibrant energy. Skyscrapers touched the night sky, their lights reflecting off the streets wet from the constant rain. Despite their modernity, there was something deeply archaic about the dark alleys and abandoned structures that hid in plain sight. My investigation began in the old neighborhood of Neo-Lumen, where disappearances were most frequent. The streets were narrow and labyrinthine, with decrepit buildings and facades covered in graffiti. As I walked, I felt a constant presence around me, as if invisible eyes were watching me with every step. The feeling of cold increased as the night progressed, and the sound of my footsteps echoed, creating an ominous symphony with the whispers of the wind. I was determined to discover the truth, and my visions began to guide my steps. Images of bloody rituals, faces distorted by fear, and shadows moving unnaturally invaded my mind. I decided to follow these leads, as disturbing as they were. The information I got on the internet and in old files pointed to a mysterious cult known as the Guardians of the Moon, who performed human sacrifices to summon demons during the red moon. My research took me to an old library located in an almost ruined building. The librarian, an elderly woman with tired eyes, watched me as I rummaged through the dusty records. "You are dealing with forces you cannot understand, young man," she said in a hoarse voice. "The Guardians of the Moon are not just a legend. They are real, and they do not tolerate intruders. Your warnings did not dissuade me. I continued my search, and one night, while reviewing some photos, I noticed a shadowy figure in all of them. An indistinct shadow, almost imperceptible but clearly present. The same figure appeared in different places around the city, always lurking. I decided I needed to find this figure and understand his role in the disappearances. As I wandered the streets of Neo-Lumen, I came across a hooded man, watching me from the shadows. I decided to confront him, but as I approached, he disappeared, leaving only a note. "At midnight, in the old theater," the note said. The ancient theater was known for being a place of secret rituals and meetings, abandoned and feared by many. At midnight, armed with my camera and courage, I went to the theater. The place was shrouded in darkness, with only the dim light of the red moon illuminating the entrance. The interior was dilapidated, with broken chairs and moldy curtains. On stage, I saw strange symbols and unlit candles, evidence of recent rituals. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw the shadowy figure, now clearer. He was a tall man, with eyes glowing red. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing off the theater walls. "The Guardians of the Moon do not tolerate intruders." I felt a biting cold pass through my body. "Who are you? What you want from me?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "I am a guardian, and you, David, are destined to be the next sacrifice," he replied, advancing slowly. Desperately, I took a photo, hoping my camera might capture something revealing. The flash briefly illuminated the theater, and the figure recoiled, screaming in pain. I took the opportunity to escape, running through the dark streets until I found a safe place. In the following days, strange events intensified. Objects moved on their own. Shadows crept across the walls and whispers grew louder. My mind was on the verge of collapse, but I knew I couldn't give up. I decided to seek help from an old friend, Raphael, an expert in paranormal phenomena. Raphael welcomed me to his apartment full of amulets and symbols of protection. "David, you are dealing with something very dangerous," he said, after hearing my story. "The Guardians of the Moon are known for their demon summoning and manipulation abilities. We need to act quickly." With Raphael's help, we devised a plan to unmask the Guardians and stop the ritual. We discovered that the next ritual would be performed at the highest point in Neo-Lumen, in the Tower of Ascension. The tower, a modern and imposing structure, was the perfect place for a ritual that sought to dominate the city. On the night of the red moon, we infiltrated the tower. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and the feeling of oppression was overwhelming. We climbed the spiral stairs, each step echoing like a war drum. As we reached the top, we saw cult members gathered around an altar, chanting ancient chants. "Get ready, David. This is the decisive moment," whispered Raphael as we positioned ourselves to capture everything with my camera. The cult leader, a sinister-looking man with eyes glowing red, raised a dagger over a young man tied to the altar. "With this sacrifice, we will invoke the absolute power of the red moon," he proclaimed. Raphael and I interrupted the ritual, revealing ourselves to the cult. "This ends now," I shouted, pointing my camera at the leader. The leader laughed, a cold, evil laugh. "You are fools if you think you can stop us." With a gesture, he summoned shadows that materialized around us, forming grotesque and distorted creatures. Raphael began reciting protective incantations while I used my camera to capture images of the creatures, hoping that the flash would weaken them. The camera light made the shadows recede, but they continued to surround us. At the climax of the confrontation, the red moon reached its peak, and an intense light filled the tower. The shadows screamed in agony and began to dissipate. The cult leader, furious, advanced on us with his dagger drawn. In an act of desperation, Raphael cast a final spell, enveloping the leader in an aura of light. "You cannot defeat the red moon," shouted the leader, before being consumed by the light and disappearing. With the leader's defeat, the ritual was interrupted, and the heavy atmosphere began to dissipate. The disoriented cult members fled into the shadows of the city. Raphael and I freed the young man from the altar and went down the tower, exhausted but relieved. As we walked through the deserted streets of Neo-Lumen, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. "We did it, Raphael. We interrupt the ritual," he said, looking at the horizon lit by the red moon. Raphael smiled, but his gaze was cautious. "Yes, David, but evil is never completely defeated. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." That night, after we returned to the relative safety of Raphael's apartment, the sense of triumph was quickly replaced by a dark uneasiness. He felt that something dark and malevolent was still present, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to attack. Raphael, with his paranormal abilities, also seemed to feel the same oppressive presence. As we tried to rest, Raphael's apartment, normally a safe haven, began to transform into something scary. The shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen and take on a life of their own, dancing eerily in the candlelight. The wind outside whispered indistinct words that seemed to come from another world. Suddenly we heard the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. Heavy, dragging footsteps, as if something inhuman was approaching. Raphael and I exchanged worried looks. He took out a protective amulet and began to recite an incantation in a low voice, but the sound of footsteps continued to get closer. When the bedroom door slowly opened, revealing only the darkness of the hallway, the air turned cold, an intense cold that seemed to cut to the bone. From within the darkness, a distorted and macabre figure emerged, with eyes glowing a demonic red. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape. "You cannot escape me," whispered the figure, his voice echoing unearthly throughout the apartment. Raphael lifted the amulet and recited a stronger incantation, trying to ward off the creature, but the figure advanced, ignoring the protective barrier. His face was a mask of terror, a mixture of rotting flesh and living shadows. I felt an icy cold grip my heart, and my body seemed paralyzed by fear. The figure approached closer, and I could feel its putrid breath on my face. "You're mine, David," she whispered, before extending a skeletal hand towards me. Before he could touch me, Raphael launched one last desperate attempt, a lighting spell that illuminated the entire apartment. The figure backed away, screaming in agony, and disappeared into the shadows. But the relief was fleeting. We knew this was just a warning. The real danger was yet to come. The next morning, we decided we couldn't keep running. We needed to discover the origin of this evil and destroy it once and for all. Raphael suggested that we visit an ancient temple located on the outskirts of the city, where he believed we could find answers. The temple, hidden in a dense and forgotten forest, was an ancient and imposing structure, covered in moss and vegetation. The atmosphere around the temple was heavy and oppressive, as if the land itself bore the weight of centuries of suffering and pain. We entered the temple and were greeted by a sepulchral silence. The walls were covered in ancient inscriptions and strange symbols that Raphael began to decipher. "These symbols speak of a ritual to bind an ancient demon," he said, his voice thick with concern. "If the Moon Guardians manage to free this entity, we are in great danger." As we advanced through the temple, the feeling of being watched intensified. The air was heavy with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. We arrived at a central room where there was a large stone altar, covered in marks of dried blood and human bones. Suddenly, the temple doors closed with a bang, and the candles lit themselves, illuminating the room with a macabre light. The shadows around us began to move in an unsettling manner, forming grotesque and distorted figures. In the center of the room, a shadowy figure emerged from the floor, as if being ripped from hell itself. "You dare challenge me?" roared the figure, its voice reverberating off the temple walls. "I am the Lord of Shadows, and this world will be mine." Raphael began to desperately recite incantations, trying to create a protective barrier. I, armed only with my camera and a protective amulet, prepared to face the creature. The Shadow Lord advanced, and the shadows around him turned into tentacles, which whipped through the air and coiled around us. We fought with all our might, but the creature seemed invincible. Every time Raphael cast a spell, the Shadow Lord absorbed the energy and became stronger. I felt despair take over me, but something inside me refused to give up. It was then that I remembered the visions that had tormented me since childhood. Images of ancient rituals and powerful chants. With a clarity I had never experienced before, I began to recite the words that echoed in my mind. The shadows around us hesitated, and the Shadow Lord roared in frustration. "That's not possible," he shouted as the shadows began to dissipate. I continued to recite the words, feeling a powerful energy rise within me. The light from the amulet in my hand shone brightly, and the Shadow Lord began to disintegrate, screaming in agony. With one last scream, the creature exploded in a cloud of black smoke, and the temple returned to silence. The doors opened, and sunlight invaded the room. Raphael and I, exhausted and injured, left the temple, feeling an indescribable relief. "We did it," said Raphael with a tired smile. "But this victory has a price. Evil never completely disappears." As we walked back to the city, I felt like something had changed inside me. The visions were still there, but now I saw them as a gift, not a curse. We were ready to face any threat that came our way, knowing that true terror would never completely disappear. That night, as I tried to rest, I heard one last whisper in the wind. "We will meet again, David." And I knew that although we had achieved a victory, the true terror would never completely disappear. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. In the cold and remote region of Santa Elena, where the wind howls through the mountains and time seems to stand still, an ancient monastery stands alone, shrouded in mist and mystery. Known as the Monastery of St. Gabriel, this place, once a center of knowledge and spirituality, is now an emblem of horror and perdition. The stone walls hold dark secrets, and the corridors echo with the laments of monks who mysteriously disappeared centuries ago. The inhabitants of the nearby villages avoid the place, whispering of vengeful spirits and a demonic grimoire that brought ruin to the monastery. My name is Katerina, and I am a historian determined to uncover the truth behind these events. Since I was young, I have been fascinated by historical mysteries and ancient legends. When I learned of the history of the Monastery of St. Gabriel, I felt an irresistible pull. I decided that I had to investigate this place, not only for my own research, but also to satisfy a growing personal curiosity. I arrived in Santa Elena on a cloudy afternoon, when the sun was barely visible behind the thick clouds. The small village seemed deserted, with only a few elderly residents watching me with suspicious eyes. I stayed at the only local inn, a modest and welcoming building, where I met the owner, Donna Marta, a woman with white hair and eyes full of untold stories. That night, while we were having dinner, I asked Donna Marta about the monastery. She hesitated, looking around as if she feared being heard by the walls themselves. "Why do you want to know about that place, my daughter?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I explained my profession and my interest in discovering the truth about the missing monks. Donna Marta sighed, her eyes growing somber. "That is a cursed place. The monks have tampered with forces they do not understand. They say they found an ancient grimoire full of rituals and spells. They tried to destroy the book, but ended up bringing a curse upon themselves. Since then, no one who enters the monastery has been unharmed. However, I was determined to investigate." The next morning, armed with my camera, notebook, and flashlight, I set off for the monastery. The trek through the mountains was arduous, the biting wind and thick fog making it difficult to see. When I finally reached the monastery's rusty gate, a chill ran down my spine. The place was in ruins, with vegetation growing wildly, and the structure threatening to collapse at any moment. As I entered, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The air was cold and dense, and darkness seemed to swallow everything around it. The stone walls, covered in moss, gave off a musty, decaying smell. I began my exploration of the corridors, illuminating the way with my flashlight. Each step seemed to echo endlessly, and the feeling of being watched was constant. As I walked further, small, disturbing events began to occur. Objects fell by themselves, shadows danced on the walls, and inaudible whispers echoed through the halls. I tried to remain calm, but my fear grew with each passing moment. I found an old library, with shelves full of dusty books and manuscripts scattered across the floor. I searched the place, searching for clues about the grimoire. It was then that I found a dusty diary belonging to Friar Alberto, one of the monastery's monks. The pages were filled with disturbing accounts of dark visions, secret rituals, and the presence of something evil that haunted them. As I read, I felt a cold wind pass over me, and the flashlight suddenly went out. Panic took over, but I managed to turn it on again. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps coming from an adjacent hallway. I followed the sound, trying to remain calm. The footsteps led me to a ruined chapel, where I saw the indistinct figure of a monk kneeling before the altar. As I approached, the figure disappeared, leaving only a cold, oppressive air. On the altar, I found an old violin, its strings loose and worn. I picked up the instrument, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. I continued my exploration, increasingly convinced that something terrible had happened in that place. The visions and whispers intensified, and the feeling of being followed was constant. I found a room with a pentagram drawn on the floor, melted candles around it, and dark stains that looked like blood. I remembered Dona Marta's words about the rituals, and the horror of the situation became even more real. I decided that I needed to get out of there, but the way back seemed longer and more confusing. The corridors transformed, and doors that had previously been open were now locked. I began to hear a dark melody, played on the violin, echoing through the walls. The music seemed to come from everywhere, increasing the feeling of dread. Amidst the chaos, I found a secret passage behind a bookshelf in the library. The passage led to an underground chamber, where I found the grimoire that Friar Alberto had mentioned in his diary. The pages of the book were filled with symbols and rituals that I could barely understand. I felt the presence of something evil growing around me. As he tried to decipher the grimoire, the violin melody became louder and more frantic. The monk's figure appeared again, this time closer and more threatening. He looked at me with blank eyes, and his skeletal hand pointed to the grimoire. I understood that I needed to perform one last ritual to try to appease the spirits and free the monastery from its curse. With shaking hands, I began to recite the words of the ritual, following the instructions in the grimoire. The monk's figure began to twitch, and the shadows around him seemed to take on a life of their own, moving toward me. The temperature in the chamber dropped drastically, and the air became thick and oppressive. The moment I finished reciting the ritual, the monk's figure screamed, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The chamber shook violently, and an intense light emanated from the grimoire. The shadows dissipated, and the monk's figure disintegrated into a cloud of dust. When the light dimmed, the chamber was silent. The grimoire was burned to ashes, and the feeling of oppression was gone. I felt a strange peace, but I knew that the monastery still held many secrets. I returned to my apartment in Santa Elena, exhausted and shaken, but determined to continue my research. I knew that the story of St. Gabriel's Monastery was far from being completely told, and that my experience had only scratched the surface of the dark mysteries that place held. There was still much to discover about the monk's past, the rituals, and the demonic grimoire. I knew I would need to return to the monastery, but this time, I would be more prepared. The battle against the evil forces that haunted this place was just beginning, and I was determined to uncover all the dark secrets it hid. As I wrote my notes and organized my findings, a sense of restlessness remained. The violin I brought from the monastery now sat in the corner of my room, and sometimes at night it seemed as if I could hear its dark melody echoing softly. I knew I would need to face the spirits again, but this time I wouldn't be alone. She was ready to gather a team of experts and return to the monastery of St. Gabriel, determined to free the spirits trapped there and find all the answers she was looking for. My journey was far from over. The story of terror and mystery of the monastery of St. Gabriel still had many chapters to be written, and I was determined to be the author of that story. As the days passed, the peace I felt after leaving the monastery began to fade. The nights were filled with intense and realistic nightmares, in which I found myself once again in the dark, freezing corridors of the monastery, pursued by shadows and unintelligible whispers. The violin, left in the corner of my room, seemed to emanate its own energy, as if it were alive. One night I woke up to a high-pitched screeching sound. I stood up quickly, looking around. The violin was in the same place, but now it seemed to shine in the moonlight. I decided I needed to do something about it. I picked up the instrument and went down to the living room, determined to get rid of it once and for all. But before I could throw it away, a dark melody began to echo through the room, and I felt a cold presence behind me. I slowly turned around and saw the figure of the monk, clearer and more terrifying than ever. He was not alone. Other figures, pale and distorted, appeared beside him, their empty eyes fixed on me. The violin melody grew, filling the room with a sense of despair and pain. "Why did you bring us back?" The monk's voice echoed, low and full of anger. "You freed the grimoire, but our curse still binds us." I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. I felt paralyzed by fear, unable to move a muscle. The figures began to approach, and the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The air was so cold that my breath turned to mist before me. Desperate, I ran to my bag and took out Fray Alberto's diary. There was one last passage that I hadn't been able to fully decipher, something about a final banishing ritual. I began to read the words aloud, my shaky voice echoing through the room. The figures backed away slightly, but the monk remained motionless, his eyes fixed on mine. "Do you think you can banish us again?" he mocked, his voice icy. "We are part of this place, part of you." I continued reading, trying to ignore the terror that consumed me. The violin melody became more frantic, and the surrounding shadows began to writhe. I felt surrounded by an oppressive darkness, as if the air itself was closing in on me. The figures advanced again, and I felt a cold hand grab my arm. "There is no escape," whispered the monk, his voice echoing in my mind. "You released evil. Now you are part of it." With supreme effort, I recited the final words of the ritual. The violin made a high-pitched sound, almost like a scream of agony, and an intense light filled the room. The figures screamed, their forms disintegrating into clouds of darkness that were sucked into the violin. The monk shouted, his expression of hatred turning into despair, and he disappeared along with the shadows. When the light dimmed, the room was silent. The violin was in pieces, burned beyond recognition. I felt exhausted, but I knew I needed to fully understand what had happened. I went back to Fray Alberto's diary, looking for answers. I discovered that the violin was just a receptacle for the curse, but the real evil was still in the monastery. With a heavy heart, I realized that I needed to return to the monastery one last time. I knew that my fight against evil was far from over. I called some fellow historians and occult researchers explaining the situation. We formed a small team, determined to end the curse once and for all. The next morning, we left for the monastery. The walk through the mountains was even more difficult than before, with the feeling of oppression increasing with each step. When we finally arrived, the monastery looked even darker and more decayed. The rusty gate creaked open, and we entered cautiously. The air was cold and heavy, and the darkness felt alive, moving around us. We began exploring the monastery, lighting the way with flashlights. Each hallway seemed like a maze of shadows and whispers, and the feeling of being watched was constant. As we progressed, small disturbing events began to happen again. Objects fell by themselves, shadows danced on the walls, and inaudible whispers echoed through the hallways. We tried to remain calm, but the fear grew with each moment. We found the library again, and I decided to look for more clues. It was then that we found a second diary, hidden in a false wall. It belonged to Friar Mateus, one of the monks who had tried to destroy the grimoire. The pages were full of even more disturbing reports about the rituals and the presence of something evil that haunted them. As I read, I felt a cold wind pass over me, and the lantern suddenly went out. We turned on the flashlights again and followed the corridors, trying to find the underground chamber where we had found the grimoire. The atmosphere was even more oppressive than before, and the feeling of being followed was almost unbearable. Finally, we found the camera. The pentagram drawn on the ground was even clearer, and the air was thick with negative energy. We placed the candles around the pentagram and began to recite the final banishing ritual, following the instructions in Friar Mateus's diary. As we recited the words, the feeling of oppression increased, and the shadows around us writhed violently. The monk's figure appeared again, this time more terrifying than ever. Other figures appeared at his side, filling the chamber with an overwhelming presence. "Do you think you can destroy us?" The monk's voice echoed, his expression of hatred and pain more intense than ever. "We are eternal. You can't ban us." I continued reciting the ritual, my voice growing in intensity. The shadows around us stirred, and the chamber began to shake. The candlelight flickered, almost going out. The figures advanced, their skeletal hands outstretched towards us. With one last effort, I recited the final words of the ritual. The candlelight shone brightly, and a wave of energy swept through the chamber. The figures screamed, their forms disintegrating into a cloud of darkness that was sucked into the pentagram. The monk tried to resist, but was pulled back by the force of the ritual. Suddenly, the chamber began to collapse. The walls cracked, and the ground beneath our feet began to give way. We ran to the exit, feeling the invisible force pulling us. The candlelight exploded in a blinding flash, and we were thrown from the chamber. When the light faded, the monastery lay in ruins. The silence was absolute, and the sense of oppression had disappeared. We were exhausted but alive. We knew we had faced something truly terrible and survived, but the experience had left us scarred forever. We returned to the village, ready to start our lives over. But as we walked away, I looked back one last time. In the darkness, a shadow moved and a voice whispered softly in my ear, "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over." I knew our fight against evil had only just begun, but we were determined to face whatever challenge lay ahead, with the courage and determination to never give up on the light, even in the darkest nights. The story of the monastery scrolls had come to an end, but the fight against evil and the shadows that lurk in the depths of the night would continue, with each of us bearing the scars of what we had faced and the determination to never let the darkness win. Deep within a futuristic city, where neon lights flash incessantly and skyscrapers pierce the shadowy skies, there exists a network of powerful and influential people operating in the shadows. Among the corrupt megacorporations and seedy neighborhoods, there are whispers of an occult cult known as the Eternal Night. Apparently an ordinary organization, this sect hides terrible secrets involving dark rituals and entities from other dimensions. For investigative journalist Maya, known for unmasking secret sects, this would be the case that would change her life forever. My name is Maya. For as long as I can remember, I have always been driven by the need to reveal the truth and expose the darkest secrets. My work as an investigative journalist has put me in dangerous situations, but nothing prepared me for what I found while investigating the Eternal Night. It was a cold, rainy night when I decided I needed to infiltrate the sect to find out what really happened behind closed doors. What I found was beyond my worst nightmares. It all started with a series of mysterious disappearances in the city. Ordinary people of different ages and social classes simply disappeared without a trace. The police seemed powerless and the media did not pay enough attention. My instinct told me there was something bigger behind this, something that required deeper investigation. So I dove headfirst into this mystery. My first clue came from an anonymous source who sent me a package containing encrypted documents and a key to an apartment in the city center. Deciphering those documents led me to discover a connection between the disappearances and a technology company called Nexus Corp. The CEO, Victor Morgado, was known for his wealth and influence, but few knew of his links to the occult. I decided to investigate more about Morgado and Nexus Corp. That's when I met Anna, a former company employee who was willing to speak, but only on condition of anonymity. We met in a discreet cafe where she revealed disturbing details about rituals carried out in the basements of Nexus Corp. She spoke about Victor Morgado and his involvement with the Eternal Night, a sect that used advanced technology to summon entities from other dimensions. As I listened to Anna, I couldn't help but notice a man sitting a few tables away who seemed to be watching us. My intuition warned me, but I continued the conversation. Anna mentioned that the rituals involved not only technology, but also mental manipulation, creating illusions and controlling minds. She was rightly scared and said that those who tried to leave the sect were permanently silenced. I left the cafe with more questions than answers, but with renewed determination. I needed to find out more about these rituals and how Victor Morgado was connected to the disappearances. I decided that my next step would be to infiltrate one of the cult's events, which meant a huge risk. That night, as I prepared to storm the Nexus Corp building, I heard a noise coming from my office. It was a subtle sound, like a distant whisper. My spine froze. I walked slowly to the door where I found a small box left anonymously. Inside, there was a video recording. As I watched, I saw disturbing images of a ritual taking place in an unknown place, with people in a trance and shadowy figures all around. The video also showed Victor Morgado reciting words in an unknown language as the room filled with a pale, spectral light. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I was getting closer to the truth, but the danger was also closer than ever. That same night, I decided to go ahead with my infiltration plan. Undercover, I managed to enter the Nexus Corp building during a gala. The environment was full of influential people, all oblivious to what was really happening in the company's basement. I managed to access Victor Morgado's private elevator using the key that Anna had given me. I went underground, where the air was heavy and the darkness almost palpable. The hallway was lit only by emergency lights, creating dancing shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the silence, broken only by the distant sound of machinery, was unsettling. When I finally reached a large steel door, I took a deep breath and pushed it open. What I found on the other side was a large hall, decorated with strange and ancient symbols. In the center, there was an altar with artifacts that glowed with a light of their own. All around, members of the sect were gathered, all in absolute silence, as if waiting for something. It was then that I saw Victor Morgado standing before the altar, holding an ancient book and reciting words in an unknown language. Around him, shadowy figures seemed to emerge from the shadows, as if they were responding to his call. The air became heavy, and I felt a piercing cold that paralyzed me for a moment. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly and found Anna. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her eyes filled with dread. "They know you're investigating. We need to get out of here now." Before she could respond, Victor Morgado looked up and saw us. An evil smile spread across his face. "It appears we have unwanted visitors," he said, and the cult members turned to us. Panic gripped me, and Anna and I ran toward the exit. As we ran through the dark hallways, I felt like the shadows were chasing us. The whispers grew louder, turning into distorted screams that echoed in my mind. We managed to reach the elevator, but it was unresponsive. We were trapped. It was then that Anna revealed a disturbing secret. "There is an exit through the ancient tunnels," she said, pointing to a hidden door, "but it's dangerous. Those who entered never left." With no other option, we decided to take the risk. We entered the tunnel, feeling the oppression of the narrow walls and the stuffy air. Every step was a challenge, and shadows seemed to move around us. I felt a constant presence, as if we were being watched. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel. Someone was following us. "Pick up your pace," I whispered to Anna, who was visibly terrified. The footsteps approached, and the feeling of danger was overwhelming. Finally, we saw a faint light ahead, the exit of the tunnel. We ran desperately, but before we reached her, a shadowy figure blocked our path. It was Victor Morgado with a sinister smile on his face. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls. Absolute panic took over me. Anna and I were trapped with no way out. It was then that I remembered the video I received and the words Morgado had recited. If he was summoning something, maybe I could reverse the spell. With what little strength I had left, I began to recite the words I remembered from the video, my voice shaky but determined. Victor laughed, but his laughter was cut off when the atmosphere began to change. The light at the end of the tunnel brightened and the shadows around us began to dissipate. Victor tried to advance, but an invisible force stopped him. The shadows he controlled began to turn against him, and his scream of pain echoed through the tunnel. We seized the opportunity and ran towards the light. Emerging from the tunnel, we felt fresh air and sunlight for the first time in hours. We were safe, but we knew the fight was far from over. Victor Morgado and the Eternal Night were still out there, and we needed to completely unmask them. Today, as I write these words, I know that we face something far beyond what we could imagine. The darkness may have receded, but the memory of that night will never completely disappear. I know we need to be vigilant, for terror can return at any moment, always lurking, ready to envelop us in its cold, deadly embrace once again. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I know that true tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. The relief of being out of the tunnel was momentary. As we looked around, we realized we were in an abandoned area of the city, surrounded by dilapidated buildings and deserted streets. The feeling of security was fragile, like a bubble about to burst. Anna was pale, her body shaking visibly. We decided to seek refuge in one of these buildings to plan our next move and try to understand what we were really facing. We found an old textile factory, its walls covered in graffiti and broken windows. We entered cautiously, our footsteps echoing through the empty space. The air was thick with the smell of rust and dust. We settled into a room that looked like an old office and tried to calm our nerves. "We need to find a way to expose the Eternal Night," said Anna, her voice still shaking. "But Victor Morgado is too powerful. It has influence at all levels of society." I agreed, knowing she was right. "We have to be careful," I replied. "But first, we need to find out more about these rituals and how he is controlling these entities." We decided to explore the factory for anything that could help us. As we walked through the shadowy hallways, I began to feel a growing sense of oppression, as if something invisible was watching us. The whispers returned, more intense, echoing off the rusty metal walls. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise coming from the upper floor. It sounded like something heavy being dragged. Anna and I exchanged apprehensive glances, but we knew we couldn't ignore it. We climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking beneath our feet. Upon reaching the upper floor, we found a room full of old machines and tools scattered around. In the center of the room, there was a large circle drawn on the floor with symbols I recognized from Morgado's documents. The air was chilly, and a fine mist hung over the circle. Before we could react, the lights began to flicker, plunging the room into a dance of light and shadows. The machines around us began to move on their own, the metallic sounds reverberating through the space. I felt a chill go up my spine. Anna held my arm tightly. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, but something was stopping us. It was as if an invisible force was holding us in place. Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the circle. It was tall and indistinct, its eyes glowing with a spectral light. "You shouldn't be here," said the figure, his voice echoing like thunder. Panic took over me, but I tried to remain calm. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I am a guardian," replied the figure. "I was conjured to protect the secrets of the Eternal Night. You have desecrated this place, and now you will pay the price." The atmosphere became even heavier, and the shadows around us began to move, taking on grotesque shapes. I felt a crushing pressure in my chest, as if the air was being sucked out of the room. We needed to find a way out of there. I remembered the words I recited in the tunnel and began to repeat the invocation, hoping that it could help us again. The shadowy figure screamed in rage, but the light around us began to intensify. The shadows retreated, and the figure began to disintegrate. We took the opportunity and ran to the exit, quickly going down the stairs. The whispers still echoed, but the oppression was easing. We left the factory, our hearts beating fast, and decided to look for a safer place. I found an old warehouse on the outskirts of town where we could temporarily hide. The place had been abandoned for years, covered in dust and cobwebs, but at least it was a refuge. As we settled in, I started rummaging through my bag for the documents and video I had received. We needed to analyze everything again, find something that would help us unmask Morgado and end the eternal night once and for all. It was then that Anna found an old book hidden in a metal box. The pages were yellowed with age, and the text was written in an ancient language. "It looks like a grimoire," she said, leafing through the pages carefully. "Maybe this could give us an advantage." As we studied the book, I began to feel a presence again. I looked around, but there was nothing visible. However, the feeling of being watched was inescapable. The words in the book described rituals of protection and invocation, and we realized that we needed to perform one of these rituals to protect ourselves. Preparing the ritual was not easy. We needed specific ingredients and a safe place to do it. We went in search of the necessary items, trying to avoid being seen. The city seemed darker than ever, and every corner seemed to hide a new danger. When we finally managed to gather everything, we returned to the warehouse and began the ritual. We light candles around a circle drawn on the floor and begin to recite the words from the grimoire. The atmosphere became tense, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. Suddenly, an intense light filled the warehouse, and I felt a benevolent presence around us. The shadows receded, and the feeling of oppression lessened. We knew the ritual had worked, but we also knew the fight was far from over. As we recovered, I heard a sound coming from outside. I peeked out the window and saw a group of people approaching. I recognized some of them as members of the Eternal Night. "They found us," said Anna, panic evident in her voice. "We needed to prepare for defense." I locked all the entrances to the warehouse and prepared our few weapons. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but we were determined to fight. The footsteps approached, and the sound of whispering voices was almost deafening. Suddenly, the door was broken down, and the sect members broke into the warehouse. His eyes shone with an insane light, and we could feel the evil emanating from them. Anna and I positioned ourselves, ready to face whatever came. The fight was intense. We used everything we had learned, the protection rituals and the few weapons we had. Shadows danced around us, and the air was thick with the sounds of screams and whispers. At every moment, it felt like we were about to be overpowered. It was then that I felt a renewed strength within me. I began to recite the words from the grimoire again, my voice steady and determined. The light around us intensified, and the sect members began to retreat, their screams of pain echoing throughout the warehouse. Finally, as the last of them fell, the light began to dissipate. Anna and I were exhausted, but we knew we had won this battle. But we also knew that the war was far from over. Victor Morgado was still out there, and the Eternal Night was still a threat. As we recovered, we swore an oath to continue fighting. We knew that darkness never completely disappears, but we were determined to bring light back to our city. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I know that true tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day finally we can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. We were at the limit of our strength, but we knew we couldn't stop. The shadows may have retreated temporarily, but the presence of Victor Morgado and the Eternal Night was still palpable. We decided it was time to go directly to him, face the sect leader, and end his influence once and for all. We gathered our forces and prepared for the last battle. We used the grimoire to strengthen our defenses and draw up a plan. We discovered that Morgado would perform a great ritual that same night, in an isolated place full of dark symbolism, an old abandoned chapel in the forest. When night fell, we headed there. The darkness was thick, and the path through the forest was filled with disturbing sounds. The howl of the wind through the trees, branches snapping under our feet, and the occasional distant cry of an animal. Each step increased the tension, and I felt a growing cold, as if the night itself were alive and watching our movements. We arrived at the chapel and saw the faint light of candles flickering through the broken windows. The silence was crushing, and the air was filled with a sense of impending evil. We entered cautiously, our hearts beating fast. The chapel was decorated with ancient symbols and human bones, a scene worthy of the worst nightmares. In the center of the main hall, Victor Morgado was standing, surrounded by his followers. He recited words in an ancient language, his voice resounding off the wooden walls. There was a circle drawn on the floor, filled with fresh blood, and within it, a grotesque creature was emerging. A deformed figure, half human, half beast, with eyes that they glowed with an ancient hatred. "You arrived at the right time," said Morgado, with a sinister smile. "Prepare to witness the birth of a new age of darkness." Anna and I positioned ourselves, trying to ignore the absolute dread that enveloped us. We knew this was our last chance. We began to recite the words from the grimoire, our voices joining together in a desperate chant of protection and resistance. The atmosphere around us became even denser, and the shadows began to move again, as if they were attracted by the energy of the ritual. Morgado laughed, his voice echoing through the chapel. "Do you think you can defeat me with childish tricks? I am the chosen one of eternal night, the bringer of darkness." Suddenly the candles went out, plunging the chapel into complete darkness. We felt crushing pressure, as if the air was being sucked out of place. The creature in the circle let out an inhuman scream, and I felt an intense cold run through my body. It was then that I saw Anna being pulled into the circle by an invisible force. "Anna!" I shouted, trying to reach her, but an invisible barrier stopped me. Victor Morgado continued to recite his incantation, and the creature got closer and closer to Anna. Desperately, I remembered a passage in the grimoire that mentioned a sacrifice to break the cycle of darkness. I knew I needed to act quickly. I grabbed a ceremonial dagger from the altar and, with one last look at Anna, cut my hand, letting the blood drip onto the floor. "I offer my blood to break this cycle of darkness," I shouted, my voice echoing through the chapel. The pain was unbearable, but I continued reciting the words from the grimoire. The creature hesitated, and the invisible barrier around the circle began to weaken. Morgado screamed in anger, but it was too late. Light began to emerge from the ground, intense and purifying. The creature let out one last scream and began to disintegrate, its parts turning to dust before disappearing completely. Morgado tried to flee, but the light enveloped him, burning him with an intensity he could not bear. His screams echoed through the chapel as his body fell apart, and finally the darkness he had summoned was dispelled. Anna fell to the ground, exhausted, but alive. I ran to her and hugged her, feeling the tension gradually ease. We knew we had won, but the victory had a bitter taste. The chapel was in ruins, but now it was a place of light, free from the evil influence of the eternal night. In the days that followed, the city began to recover. News of Victor Morgado's fall spread, and his followers were arrested or dispersed. The sense of security returned, but we knew that true peace was still out of reach. As I write these words, I know that we face something far beyond what we could imagine. The darkness may have receded, but the memory of that night will never completely disappear. I know we need to be vigilant, for terror can return at any moment, always lurking, ready to envelop us in its cold, deadly embrace once again. And so my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I know that true tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again.